Agree. I will say, and we also need to be real before we finish up here about if many in the sectors are interested to move to become more rigorous about what are their remaining roles. Any of the roles that we sketched between Peace Directs and Barney and mine, and other roles that other people, brilliant people, can think of, I suspect that it will mean that many less people will have jobs in the sector who currently work there. I think these organizations will be much smaller in size, and they will require different competencies to some extent than what is represented now. So it's a very painful future if you look it in the eye. And sometimes when I say that, I get a kind of a blank stare, and I don't know what that means. And people move on, right? But we're talking about very specific niche roles that are much more about connecting than about doing.
Thanks, Tosca, for joining me on the light side of green. I'm super excited to be having this conversation with you. We've got a lot of topics to be getting through today.
We
But
do.
before we get into that, maybe you can give us just a little bit of your background, who you are, and how you've come to where you are today.
I will be happy to do that, and I just want to give you the give you thanks for the opportunity, Anton, but also for sending me a really juicy kind of set of questions. I appreciate that. It sparks my mind in a good fashion. So yeah, on the one hand, so my career started about 30 years ago. On the one hand, in a very classical way, I was your classical average international development worker, right? I'm from the Netherlands originally, and but I've now lived outside the Netherlands for as long as I've lived inside there. And I started out working at an EU-focused think tank, worked at the World Bank, both headquarters in Washington, D.C., but also 4 years the head of social development in the World Bank's Vietnam team, worked in Cambodia with the United Nations peacekeeping operation and with UNDP and an American NGO. That was all kind of your classical, kind of in my case, 16-year kind of trajectory of doing international development work with a focus already to some extent on civil society, but also as much on social development. So all these factors that all these non-economic factors that affect poverty and disenfranchisement, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then things got I took a left turn into academia, and that happened purely accidentally. So I used to call myself during that phase an accidental pracademic. That is not my own term, but I do think it fits me. And I ended up working at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. That is in upstate New York, so New York State, though not New York City. It's more in the rural part of New York State here in the US. And the Maxwell School happens to be, for 20 years in a row now, happens to be ranked in what is, I should definitely be transparent about that, a contentious ranking system here in the US for academic institutions as the number one school at the graduate level in one particular discipline, which is public administration and public management. And I ran a program there on international NGOs, and we were focused really on their organization. So what the organizational development, but also what kind of organizational animals, as I like to call it, are INGOs, and particularly Global North founded INGOs. So we focused on their governance, their leadership effectiveness and leadership development, and their overall organizational effectiveness. And we can go more into that if you want, but basically on the practitioner side, half of my time and my small team's time, we focused on things that were of practical relevance to NGO leaders, board members, and managers in two particular areas. So the first area was senior leadership training, senior leadership development training. And so we offered, I think, a total of about 22 or so kind of classical 5.5 day training programs for particularly the second tier of people at the second tier of responsibility
Hmm.
in both Global North founded INGOs and sometimes also in Global South founded national NGOs. And so the particular question was, what is different when you move from a second tier of responsibility and you already have an whole of organization responsibility, so not just one team, one unit, but you
Hmm.
already are as part of a senior leadership team. What do you need to be and do differently when you go to the very top?
Right.
Um, the other offering was on change management. So basically, we advised, well, we helped with the external learning of, or how should I say this, external assessment of, learning reviews of the way in which about 4 to 6 big global NGOs, Save the Children, Oxfam, CARE, and Amnesty in that case, how they had gone about designing, planning, but also implementing big organizational change processes. And what can we learn about change leadership and change management? They asked us to do that. So that was my kind of stint in academia, in addition to, of course, contributing to research and teaching at the graduate level. And then I made another left turn into independent consulting, coaching, and team coaching. So that's where I am right now. I'm the owner of Five Oaks Consulting. If people are thinking, what the hell, what is a strange name that is simply because my Dutch, very difficult to pronounce last name, means of the five oak trees. I am literally called in Dutch Tosca of the five oak trees. So that's why I called my small consulting and coaching and team coaching practice there. So let me stop there and see if that is what you were hoping for.
No, perfect. Thank you, Tosca. And actually, I should have asked you this before we began, but how do you pronounce your last name?
Thank you for asking. I appreciate that. So my last name, my Dutch last name, after the hyphen in my
Hmm.
last name is Van Vijfeiken.
Vijfeiken, and that is
Van Vijfeiken. Of
Vijfeiken
the
is
five
five
oak.
oaks.
Got
Very
it.
good, excellent. So
Yes.
thank
Go ahead. Sorry.
so thank you for that, Tosca. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of topics to try to get through today. One of the first times I saw your work was when I was looking through a paper that was produced by Unorthodox,
Mm,
that you co-authored with Barney Talek and a few other consultants, and that
absolutely.
was about the future of NGOs. And it's a very comprehensive document, and I spent a lot of time working through it. And at my question, a question kept coming up about the paper when I was reading that, and it was, there seems to be an emphasis of a need to change, like
Mm,
something has to change or the system needs to change. And I couldn't understand, because of my background being from outside of the NGO system, I couldn't understand where that was coming from. Why is there this emphasis to need to change? Is it that things are not going well, or have there been bad results? What's happening right now? If you could give us a bit of that context.
okay. Yeah. So you don't want me to go into the unorthodox report on future roles, right? But more broadly, because that report, as you know, was particularly focusing on conservation NGOs.
Hmm.
However, and what we did in the report is we sketched out with about 4 or 5 co-authors. We sketched out 15 propositions for potential new roles, right? But
Right.
but we will go into that now. Your question, I think, is broader. Um, it's, well, let me say first, Anton, it's not the first time that both Global North founded NGOs, and to some extent, Global South founded civil society organizations are attempting to go through significant change, right? So
Right.
this is not the first time in their history,
Hmm.
um, but it's definitely another kind of distinct phase. I would say this phase has to do with a whole range of factors, and there's no way I could give a comprehensive list for that. So I'm just
Sure.
going to give you a couple of kind of things that stand out in my mind.
Hmm.
One, importantly, is that Global North founded NGOs are increasingly criticized, and understandably so, by Global South founded civil society, at least by a part of it. And maybe we can return to that later. I'm kind of curious about what part that is. But Global South civil society says, listen, guys, we're mature. We have had several decades to grow into our own kind of capacity and
Hmm.
our own maturity. And we want you, Global North NGOs, to not no longer crowd us out, right? We don't want you to compete with us. Um, that is definitely one critique. And with that comes, of course, the critique that even though international development, and when I say that, I mean everything from long-term development to humanitarian relief to environment to human rights,
Hmm.
et cetera, right? Um, that even though the intentions may have been good of Global North founded NGOs to do work in the Global South, that really there was still, at the very least, remnants of neo-colonial or colonial attitudes and mindsets and practices. And so the critique was that it's high time that we change that, and you need to, and the hashtag shift to power came up, etc., decolonizing aid, decolonizing NGOs, and so on, power shift. These terms came up. At the same time, there are also other developments. One is that, let's face it, Global North founded NGOs are a little bit what some people might call legacy organizations. Some other
Hmm.
people, they've been around for decades, right? As we describe in our book, Between Power and Irrelevance, The Future of Transnational NGOs,
Hmm.
um, that I'm a co author of. Global North founded NGOs rose in power, and I mean power in the broadest sense of the word, um, and programming scale and scope, and the role next to private sector and government, etc., and in resources for a couple of decades. But
Hmm.
we've
Right.
seen those resources plateau,
Right.
right? And in fact, they've gone down, and there is continuing to be extensive practice pressure on these revenues, and therefore, what can be done programmatically.
Hmm.
Um, and other actors have taken the stage, right? So, social enterprises, philanthrocapitalism, impact investing. Contractors, just purely if you look at the big bilateral and multilateral organizations,
Hmm.
World Bank, IMF, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, Inter-America, et cetera, and bilaterals have always used also private sector contractors to
Right.
right to implement projects and programs. And in fact, the scale of that subsector is, I don't know what the most recent numbers are, but at one point in the last 5 to 8 years, it was like 7 times that of NGOs. And then there's another competitor, and that is digital NGO platforms, right? Either for fundraising purposes. So this is kind of direct citizen to citizen fundraising that you
Hmm.
see a number of platforms over the last 10 years,
Right.
as well as advocacy, right? Think about avas.org, Jatka in India, here in the US, moveon.org, and in so many other countries where public advocacy and campaigning is happening against citizen to government or other targets, multinationals, etc., through digital petitioning platforms and other forms of digital activism. And that has partially to do again with the fact that younger generations of citizens do not no longer want to be told by nonprofits and NGOs when to give money, when to send a letter, when to show up on the streets to mobilize, right? When to write
Sure.
a letter to some mainstream media, etc., etc. They want to take action on their own terms. So those digital platforms have also really become a competitor. Those are some reasons, and then I will mention one more, and that is that there has been increasing criticism, also in a sustained fashion now, that the sector does not have enough results to show for. That for a long time, program and project evaluation were largely absent. Now, we can go into the reasons for that, and that definitely there's also a funder reason for that.
Hmm.
But that really NGOs made a whole bunch of claims about their effectiveness that they really couldn't back up. And if they tried to back it up, it was with very qualitative stories, right, of positive impact that were anecdotal stories that look and sound and feel good to some small donors, particularly, or high wealth donors, but really were not a proof of impact. Now, that has changed quite a bit, particularly for mid to large size ones. But that criticism, too, by the public, by institutional funders, by the media, etc., is also another impetus for change. So I'm just mentioning a few from probably a bigger grab bag of reasons.
Yeah, no, sure. And that kind of seems to resonate with myself. I think as a consumer, there's been a change over the last few years or the last decade or so, in that the world is become smaller now, right? There was a time where trying to fund actions in India or in Africa or in Asia was something that was very far away. But
Yep.
obviously, with the internet now, anyone can find any organization in any part of the world, and so it makes it. I guess I could see why people would question why we would need to fund larger northern NGOs when I could just go directly to the local communities I'm interested in. So I can see
Yeah.
that. And then the other thing that resonates with me is I feel that with the younger generation, there is generally a cynicism against corporatization and marketing, and they want things to be real and authentic, and so they, rightly or wrongly, categorize larger organizations as being not that. And so I can see there's been some cultural shifts there as well, which have supported that. I did,
Mm.
I did, however, want to double click on one of the factors you mentioned, which is decolonization, because I
Mm.
hear this being talked about a lot in the
Mm.
sector. So could you help us to understand a little bit more about, and I'm sure there's not one definition of what it means, but sort of just globally, generally, what are people talking about when they say decolonization of the sector?
Yeah, yeah. Um, would you allow me, Anton, to just look back to what you just said about
Sure.
kind of global globalization and the fact that almost every citizen in the world now has some access to what happens in very other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So that also has had an implication. So the pressure for NGOs to be more transparent about
Right.
what they do and how much they have to show for, but also, for instance, when scandals break out, and that happens from time to time in the nonprofit sector, anywhere, right, in the
Yeah.
world. But that kind of transparency, this need to be responsive to inquiries, not just from the media but also from citizen, has increased a lot and has further. And actually, NGOs have been late to the game. So while they have criticized over decades big global governance actors like the World Bank or IMF or ADB, the Asian Development Bank, to be more transparent, they themselves actually have not necessarily done much better up
Right.
till fairly recently. And the other thing is that, just mention on that, and I'll come to your next question, um, is that the agency, the ability to act, the has also increased amongst those who are the constituents of development projects and programs, right?
Right.
So a lot of citizens in the world now have a little bit more of a sense of what is the range of actors that might be willing to support my community, right? They see much more presence of local NGOs and grassroots organizations, etc., on the ground and at the national level as well, interacting with their own governments.
Hmm.
And so, while their power, their negotiation power, is not, it's not optimal for sure. They don't have complete exit voice. Their power has increased, and NGOs have also felt the effect of that. That these constituents, these program participants, sometimes have more choice now, and they
Right.
know it, and they have more also outlets to be critical or to complain when they feel that the service or program intervention is not sufficient. So just to add to that. Now, in terms of decolonizing, what does that mean? So a couple of dimensions that it can unfold. I think first and foremost about whose knowledge counts, whose voice counts, whose expertise counts, whose resources count. So let me
Hmm.
explain that a little bit. So the assertion that comes from a number of intellectuals, academics, pre-academics, as well as Southern practitioner organizations, is that the mindset of Global North NGOs, particularly of the white development workers and managers and staff and leadership and boards behind that, is still that the global south is in support, is in need of help,
Right.
that they still need us, which the assertion is, and I think there is some ground for that, is that there is still racism that is behind that. So that's kind of one of the critiques. So who decides what is valid knowledge, right? Why is the
Right.
knowledge that is collected through, I don't know, peer-reviewed journals in Western academics, why is that knowledge more credible or legitimate or listened to more than the knowledge of farmers or indigenous peoples who for hundreds of years have dealt with, for instance, a local context and the natural circumstances, etc., right? um, Within NGOs also, if you look at those NGOs that are no longer corporate hierarchically structured NGOs, where you have a headquarters that line manages country offices and country teams and so
Right.
on, um, but is more consisting of members or sections or affiliates, etc., from across the world, which quite a few NGOs are striving for more.
Hmm.
Um, why Whose knowledge is more important and whose voice is more important? So the assertion is that there is both racism behind that, and certainly an undervaluing, or that certain types of knowledge and voice and expertise count more than others. That's part of it. Obviously, kind of another factor is, how does the leadership and management and boards look like, are they, it is, I mean, if you look here in the US, surprisingly, like, I think something like 72 to 75% of boards of US nonprofits, both domestic and internationally focused ones,
Hmm.
is still white. That is not right, given that a lot of the program participants that are being supported by these nonprofits are not white. They are people of different racial and ethnic background, of different identity, right?
Right.
So that is our global leadership and management and board. Is that representative of the global population, of what is truly the global majority, which is not white people?
Hmm.
And is it truly representative of our program participant? Is another dimension of this urge to decolonize. And then when it comes to money, which always money still is power, right? A whole bunch of NGOs have tried to delink money from power in terms of who brings in money to the organization and who uses the money in programming. Um, is the fact that, let's say, a European member or an American member or an Australian member that brings in more financial resources into the NGO, does that mean they need to have more power? That is a very vexing question that a number of NGOs are trying to de-link that, and that has proven to be very, very stubborn. And that may also be because of mindsets behind that. Anyway, those are just a couple of reasons why decolonizing aid and development and NGOs is a strong call to action. And I do have a sense that while that call to action has been expressed before in the last 20 to 25 years, I
Mm-hmm.
think it has really reached a tipping point where a lot of global North founded NGOs are feeling is we need to change.
Okay, thank you for that. That's very helpful. I have a question which may be a little bit contentious,
Mm,
but let me put it out there and see how we go. When I look in at the private sector, let's say the private sector is going to has a product. They've developed a product in the US, be it a software program, and then they go to release it into Africa or into India. There's not a call for needing to diversify the racial and ethnic makeup of the board of that private company. So what I'm trying to understand is, so why is there a need to diversify the racial or ethnic makeup of the board of an NGO? How does that relate to the challenges that, or the work that the NGO is doing, or the solution that the NGO is trying to provide? What's different between, I guess, the NGO sector and the private sector in this kind of an example?
mm. Would you allow me to debate that a little bit? Your
Yeah,
claim, your assertion just now.
100%.
While I don't claim that the private sector case that you put forth and the entities that we're talking about are exactly the same, I would say if you look at the last 5 years, and particularly since George Floyd's murder in 2020,
Hmm.
but even before that, a subset of the private sector, and of course, this is a huge uh, ecosystem of actors, right? So,
Exactly.
but a subset of private sector actors have felt called or obliged, both from outside criticism, from academics and civil society, etc., and from inside also their employees, their investors,
Hmm.
right? Um, have also started to call for to diversify their boards, for instance. And there's a lot of research that not only is that from an justice perspective or an ethical perspective important, but there's lots of research that says, for instance, that boards of private sector companies that were used to be pretty male dominated for a long time and still are to some extent, that boards with a greater gender diversity simply perform better from
Better.
a bottom line perspective, right? So I would argue a little bit with you that it's they also have undergone some changes, and that has been sped up in the last couple of years. Now, of course, we also see the backlash to that. We see a counter pressure, right? Especially in a country like the US. But let's not go there for the purpose of this recording, probably. But um, having said that, and by the way, on product development, I'm not a specialist in this, but my understanding from design thinking is that it's really, really important that product developers do very have diverse teams to think through product design, and that they have to test and iterate with diverse populations, also in global sense, in order to make sure that this product can actually have a global reach. So I would want to nuance a little bit what you said.
No, no,
How
yeah,
does that
yeah.
land
No, I,
with
I
you?
think I think you're right. I think those are fair points. I think there's also another perspective as well, which is, there's a difference between a product which is, say, uh, Microsoft Word, a software product, which serves a global need. Really, what the NGOs are providing, what their product is a custom solution often. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's not a one solution fits all case. It's about solving some local problems. And
yeah.
so in that case, if your product is solving local problems, local
Mm,
needs, you
mm.
can't have a team of people that know nothing about those problems and those needs solving it. And so you
That's
do
right.
need that diversification, particularly in the
Yeah,
NGOs.
and you also, by the way, have, I believe, more and more companies where the product designers, for instance, are so globally represented themselves, right? It's no longer America or Europe or so. It is just as much an Indian company or a Chinese company, right?
Right.
That designs products that have complete global resonance.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to bring it up because, you know when I hear the idea of decolonization, there's a lot of actions that I hear being called for that I don't see in the private sector, or I don't see as vociferously as I do in the NGO sector. And so I just want to push a little
Yeah.
bit to try to understand the reasoning behind it. Um,
Can I comment on that?
yeah,
Why I think that
absolutely.
is amongst others? We've
Yeah.
already discussed a couple of reasons, but NGOs claim to be value based actors, right? And they are very proud of that.
Yeah.
It is a strong part of their identity. Sometimes I would argue too strong a part of their identity, and we can get to that later if you want to. But because we make this claim when we are called to task about the fact that actually we again, the assertion is that there are remnants of racism and of a colonized mind, etc., behind the work what we do, then that um, our sector is very sensitive to that and has to be very sensitive to that, because if the gap between what we say we are about and what we really do is too big, it's not only sustainable, but it puts us in a very bad light. Now, sometimes I think actually the fact that many of us who work in the sector, their personal identity is so intertwined with their work, and often people will say, passion. You have to bring passion to the work. That's the first thing, right? If you think about the psychological contract that NGO workers engage in, passion for the cause. It's a bigger topic, but I'll just say now, I'm actually a little critical of that, or at least I don't think it's always a good thing, because uh, when I hear passion for the cause and the willingness to work long hours
Hmm.
for not as much pay as in the private sector, I'm thinking that's all great, but it's not enough because I need to see outcomes. And when I say I, if I'm a program participant or a constituent, right, at the local level, or I'm a human rights defender who is supposed to be supported by a human rights organization, I care most about the contributions, the outcomes, right? How are you helping amplify my life and my voice, etc.? So I and on top of that, if our identity is so caught up with our work, we tend to be very brittle about feedback, the kinds of feedback that we just say. So we tend, because it's too threatening to our personal identities. And I think that's what we see sometimes in our sector, to be honest to you.
No, I 100% agree with that. I have a lot of experience working with small to medium NGOs. And one of the big things that I help those leaders with is that they're often really focused on doing things and just um, getting things done, and they're very much blinded by looking forward to where they're going. Now, part of that
Mm,
is because they're often chasing their tails in terms of funding. They're always constantly having
yeah,
to produce things to get the next bunch of money coming in. But part
yeah.
of that also is that passion, which almost acts like blinkers, because it's like if there's almost a feeling of I'm trying to do good, And as long as I just keep doing that, I'm not doing anything wrong. And
Yes.
it stops some of those leaders who are really well intentioned and very competent people, but it stops them from often reflecting on where they're going and how they're doing things, and taking the time that's needed to take changes in their path to better move forward. And so
Yeah.
I help them to do that by helping them just to calm down, take a breath, look forward, and be a little bit more humble about, it's not just about doing things and plowing forward. It's about trying to figure out how to solve problems, right? Not just do work.
Yeah, no, and there are a couple of drivers for what you just noted, in my view. One is that if you're supposed to do good, which is a question and a whole separate thing, whether that's even a good mindset to have, but let's go with that for now. Um, you feel an urge to invest resources, time and attention into the programming. You feel an urge to maximize the amount of money that goes into program and to minimize what goes into things like forward reflection, right? Or the capacity of the organization, the
Right,
systems, the
right.
infrastructure, the evaluation. Are we actually on the right path while we're working very, very hard to work, to do?
Hmm.
Um, and of course, funders for decades, it's changing a little bit in the last 3 to 5 years, but for decades, this norm, the overhead myth, right, that we write about in the book as well, particularly in some of the global north countries that I'm familiar with, the overhead myth, namely that you have to spend as little money as possible on your administration and on fundraising, has been super strong on the side of small donors
Hmm.
and high wealth individuals and even institutional donors. And so that further exacerbated this tendency that you noted on doing, etc. And then the second thing, a comment on what you said is interesting. That was an interesting statement. Passion as blinkers. I think passion can also be a blinker in another way. We already talked about that brittleness towards critique, right?
Right.
Um, but also, when I used to work at the Maxwell School, I was surrounded by a couple of political scientists who were studying the profiles of leaders in the sector, and very well-known political scientists. And they would comment on the fact that the political acumen, the savviness with which those NGOs who are trying to influence the behavior, the resource allocation, the mindsets, etc., and the policies of um, both politicians as well as senior civil servants, right,
Hmm.
as many NGOs try to do, that they actually had very little acumen in interacting with politicians and senior civil servants, because they would assume, the passion that they came from, that if those other people who they were interacting with to try to influence them, that if they don't share that passion in the same way, or and they would use very value-based language, etc.,
Hmm.
and it wasn't resonating, then the general kind of mindset was, you, target group that I'm trying to influence, your uh, your values are bad, and this is also the case for the private sector, and you're stupid, you're kind of stupid. And that is not necessarily the most effective way of influencing. So knowing, for instance, what is in the incentive systems and the environment for politicians or senior civil servants, what do they care about, and
Right.
can I um, build on that rather than trying to make them see it from our point of view of intrinsic justice, is another way in which I think passion can be a blinker. What do you think?
No, I definitely agree. Um, and I see it often with the young eco entrepreneurs that I work with. It's that passion, and it's the virtue narrative that's
Oh, yeah.
associated with working with an NGO.
Yeah.
But it's also it's a double edged sword, right? Because at the same time, you need passion to be able to take on some of these challenges, because we have seen in the past projects where people come in, they parachute in, they are all passionate and excited, but they very quickly lose enthusiasm and disappear. And so, it's a double-edged sword. It's great to see people that are passionate in there, but it can just be slightly corrupting in terms of how it influences their thinking and planning.
It can
Right,
skew,
skew
I
is
think,
a good word.
and yeah, so there's the sustainability to passion, but frankly, Anton, I just sometimes I wonder if those of us, wherever we live in the world, who want to be engaged in this type of work, it would be good enough for me if we all tried to just be really good in what we did. If we were really good at what we did, right, that to me is most important. Yes, I have a passion for working on a public cause. I'm personally not motivated to work for a private sector company, but that doesn't mean that private sector companies are not very important. It can be value-based organizations,
Yep.
right?
Right.
um, I want to work on a public cause. That is not the same as being so passionate about one particular single issue and want to drive that and drive that and drive that and judge everybody else for not having that same passion. So I would like to see a little bit more emphasis on outcomes and trying to do the best possible job rather than always saying, oh, we need to have passion.
Yeah.
And I know that's not popular to say that, but
No, no, I agree. But in this sector, there is, even going back to decolonization, right? And a part of the reason why I want to ask about that is,
Mhm.
you talk about, you like you mentioned, there's it's we should be looking at the outcomes, right? The way I talk about it as a product person is we should be
Of
focusing on
course.
the problem, focusing on what is the solution to the problem and finding that solution. So when I hear a lot of discussion about decolonization, it strikes me as concerning, because I don't hear a lot of discussion about how we're going to solve the problem. This is the decolonization is something about how we're going to do it, or how people should do it. And so
Mhm.
I get a little bit confused when I hear that. The other
Mm.
part of that is, you know, there's an element of decolonization which is about taking hierarchical structures and changing them to flatter organizations or network based organizations. And
Yeah.
that, from a management perspective, is such a complicated change process. And I
Yeah.
and the way that the word decolonization is just thrown around and said, like,
Oh,
we all need to do this,
yeah.
it really under values the complexity of that kind of change. And I get a bit concerned when I hear that.
Okay.
Um,
Can I interact with that in a couple of ways?
yeah,
Sorry,
let's
I was
let's jump into that, the complication of it.
a couple of things. So I do think in a moment, let's unpack a little bit further what we mean by decolonizing so that for our listeners, it gets more operational, right? But before I get that, I do agree with you in one way, and that is that I think there was a real impetus and a real need for this big push, right, for let's call it by shorthand decolonizing NGOs in this case.
Okay.
At the same time, at the same time, it also then it has an ideological side to it where lots of us, and this gets back to our identity, we feel good, especially I would say white um, workers in the sector, and I would include myself in that just as much, right? I am advising and supporting, etc., but I work in the sector
Hmm.
just as much in a different way. Um, there is a sense that we all then what academics call isomimicry, right? There's a lot of fashion in our sector, always has been and continues to be, right? A lot of fads that come and go, and then everybody kind of gets behind it and starts using the same terminology to the point where I think, oh, this is it's full of terminology, but what does it actually mean? I get a little yeah, I get uncomfortable with that. So I agree with you.
Hmm.
There's mimicking of each other, and that is very strong, and an ideological side to it, that the discussion can evolve into. It doesn't have to, it can. So let's unpack it a little bit more. So what do we mean? We
Right.
mean, for instance, authority and decision rights
Yep.
that used to maybe in the past be held in some form of a headquarters, that often was in the global north, is then decentralized, those decision rights, to lower levels in the organization, and as close to the level where the impact is supposed to happen,
Right.
that it's decentralized. It is doing away with classical headquarters. So even even irrespective of the pandemic and its enormous impact on where people work and how they work, etc.,
Hmm.
um, um, now you see more and more kind of centers of organizations that are completely globally distributed, right? People with whole of organization responsibilities can now work anywhere in the world. They don't have to be in the old kind of centers of power anymore,
Hmm.
whether that's Washington or Brussels or Bangkok or what have you. Um, there is the equity of pay and benefits discussion, which is very live right now, very complex,
Hmm.
both technically complex, but also obviously emotionally and politically complex and sensitive.
Yep.
But there's that dimension. There is the dimension of narrative. So how do NGOs talk about their program participants, right? Do they do it in language that is fully respectful of the people, or that makes them kind of into passive recipients and people who are always poor, or always have tears in their eyes, and don't have a sense of power and agency, etc.? So what is an ethical narrative? And also practical things like who's making the pictures or the videos, right? Why does that have to be a Spanish or a Dutch or an American
Right.
photographer or videographer, etc.?
Hmm.
Right? There's the diversifying of leadership and management compositions, right? Cohorts, less white males, and also less white females, because in
Hmm.
certain subsectors, our leadership and management has definitely feminized a lot, but it's still primarily white females who are in those positions of power. And another dimension that I just want to mention is, I hope I'm not getting too kind of geeky here, but that we want to change, or at least diversify, the underlying leadership models and frameworks that are being used to develop leaders with, right? So you see a surge of feminist leadership that is often the concepts of which have come from people like Srilata Batliwala in India and Korea, her organization, and from other feminist leadership scholars, but also experts and practitioners that are not coming from the global north.
Hmm.
So search for leadership models that are less what I call global north imprinted. These are just some of the dimensions that I thought was useful to unpack it a little bit for those of us who are not steeped in this on a day-to-day basis.
No, that's very helpful to picture and imagine what decolonization means for the organization. And I go
Yeah.
back to my point, when you look at all of those things and all of those things happening across an organization, you can see how it can be a very complicated and high risk
Mhm.
change for an organization to go through. I recently have done a fair amount of work with a medium-sized organization who was one of the top conservation organizations in a certain sector,
Mm.
and they were just growing super well and executing very well. But then they started to implement some of these changes and really pushed very hard a decentralization of decision making. And what we
Yep.
started to see over time was the organization became less responsive to those on the ground. And I was looking at the organization in my role as an advisor at the lowest level, so I was seeing the impact of the solution. And as I started to investigate more, you could see that there was political infighting. There
Mhm.
was a lack of leadership essentially, that was had grown up, and so it really made me realize that these kind of changes can be quite fraught. If
They can be flawed, and the outcomes are uncertain. So let me, let we're getting back to your last question that I think I didn't actually answer yet. So you're asking about these kind of experiments with more horizontal organizations, networked, what they like to call networked organizations. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, I am not an expert in organizational design the way some people are, and I'm not an expert in switching from whether it is from a corporate hierarchical model that's more hierarchical, or whether it's from a federated or confederated model, which a number of our organizations have also extensively experimented with and have had mixed results, to this more networked horizontal model. I'm not an expert in that. And I also think that those forays are still in their relatively early year. And so we don't know how they're going to work out, right? Um, they're definitely coming back to things that are in vogue right now. They get a lot of attention, a lot, right? And so I would say that um, my early thoughts, and no more than that, just kind of iterative thoughts to be tested and changed later for sure. But my early thoughts are that for sure the attractiveness of the network model and the horizontal decentralized model is very attractive in terms of alignment with this shift in um, uh, and I mean ideology now with a small I, not in a, I mean it in a neutral way, but a shift in thinking about what is a good global north founded, though now much more globally representative and more globally owned or shared organization. Um, it is ideologically aligned with that. So, from a political perspective, political with a small p, and from a symbolic perspective, what we are symbolically communicating through being a more horizontally decentralized organization is very useful. I can see that. I do share with you the beginning of a concern that that I don't yet know what this functionally will mean for the organization. So I was interested that you said I was observing, and you said the organization becoming less responsive to what was needed on the ground, as articulated by constituents on the ground, right? um, what I'd love for you to tell us more. Actually, what you observed there, that would be interesting. And secondly, what I worry about a little bit is, so we know that the cultures of many civil society organizations already for a couple of decades have been quite what I call high on consultation, very deliberative, lots of discussion, right? A lot of consultation, right? That's part of the kind of democratic kind of character that a lot of organizations like to be known for. Um, so we already had a fairly high, what I call transaction cost of all the discussions that needed to happen before we can get to a decision, right, on important things. In a horizontal model, in a network model, are those transaction costs even higher than they were before? Are we becoming even more internally focused, more navel gazing than we already were, while the rest of the world around us is going to hell in a handbasket? If looking at what some people call the poly crisis, right? Situation of the world, I do worry about that aspect. And I worry about our ability as organizations to make uh, uh, decisions in a way that reflect this ideal of shared leadership, while at the same time being agile and responsive and adaptive to when the external environment changes, or when our program participants say that they need different things. The local environment calls for different things. So those are a couple of kind of early thoughts I have, not conclusive, but I would like us to still pay some attention. Is this actually going to work? Because ultimately, I don't really care whether I'm a program participant of an NGO funded program or whether I'm a small donor. I don't really care how internally democratic and horizontal you are. I care about what the outcomes are on the ground. And so I'll finish this rant by saying I'm increasingly a little worried what NGOs are all about in terms of the people who populate them. Are we about, as staff and leaders and board members, are we about kind of actualizing our global citizenship through working in these organizations? Is that what we're first about? Or are we about maximizing the outcomes that we are contributing to? I sometimes wonder whether the pendulum has shifted too much to the former rather than the latter, and I'm not totally comfortable with that. So this is just me thinking aloud. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that aligns with what I've seen and what some of my concerns are. Like yourself, I'm not an expert in organizational management or change. I've grown organizations myself, and I understand how small changes can have very significant impacts. And one of the things that I learned was if you do change for the wrong reason, it's almost guaranteed to go wrong. And I learned
Mm.
that the hard way. And so when I look at some of this change, you know, it's difficult, right? Because again, everyone in this sector is well intentioned, and there's highly competent people in the sector. But if the decisions are being made to make change and it's not focused on change that better serves the end beneficiary, um, then that change is it's going to be hard to make that change in a way that maintains the value that you're providing.
At the same time, though,
Mm-hmm.
people who would are proponents of this, they would say, and I think they would make a solid point, and saying we can make better decisions because we have more people in decision making power who are local to the issue, right, and who are diverse, who have that set of knowledges and resources and expertise that is not just kind of coming from the global um, north. So we can support program participants or constituents more. What I worry, the dimension that I particularly worry is about is I see a lot of drive for consensus in our organizations. And I was just seeing a piece of research that says that a lot of human beings like to go for consensus if at all
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
possible. And
sure.
what I see is a lot of endless deliberation to get to consensus, resulting in a fairly low quality decision that is kind of a lowest common denominator type of decision.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I see decisions finally coming to a close, and then somebody else feels empowered to reopen that same discussion. So that's what I worry about. While the external world keeps spinning harder and harder and in some really problematic ways,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if we're getting so caught up in those internal transactions and reverberations. And then over on top of that, we see a lot of strife within our sector internally, a lot of conflict and not a great conflict management capability. So I worry about that dimension as well.
No, you're right. And not long ago, I was talking to Charles Kojo van Dyke
Hmm.
of the WACC, and he was talking to me about his the Ringo reimagining international NGOs, and one
Yep.
of the issues he brought up was the challenge of localization, meaning that it's great that these NGOs are making change, but they're now dropping in local organizations into our regions, which are now directly competing with our CSOs. And
Yeah.
I thought, that was a very interesting externalization of this change. I'm not sure if you've seen much of that, or you hear
Oh
much of
yeah.
that.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. And Charles is a great thinker and doer. I really respect him. He's also been on my podcast recently. Um, so so the movement to set up national NGOs as part of global confederations or federation has been going on for about 10 years, particularly with the big global brand
Right.
names, right?
Hmm.
So Save the Children, Oxfam, Amnesty already much longer because Amnesty is a membership organization, etc., etc. Um, and the impetus was we want to be as from a membership perspective, and I mean now the countries as the members, right? We want to be more representative, and we
Hmm.
want to have global balance of global South and global North members. It's a great um, impetus and ideal, if you will.
Right.
It's very easy to understand why it was felt necessary. Now, the thought was that global South civil society would then consider these NGOs more legitimate, etc., and that governments and the national private sector, etc., would find them more legitimate. The interesting thing is, and I'm not saying that, by the way, I think the jury is out whether having an Oxfam Malawi or a Greenpeace Mexico
Hmm.
is a helpful civil society actor to have. I think in some ways there is a need for this, um, as long as these members are very respectful in how they want to partner with local civil society and
Hmm.
make sure that they don't take over. They have more resources. They have the global brand name behind them. They have the financial resources behind them. They have the access to professional development that
Right.
some of the local NGOs may not have, etc. They may be able to be a buffer between local civil society and the government in a
Hmm.
very useful
Yep.
way, right? So I do think they can play a role. And I think the competing and crowding out can happen
Sure.
if these national members of global NGOs are not sufficiently self aware. I sometimes, and this gets us to a broader question, when the critique from a part of global civil society, as Charles was referencing, is that they are competing and crowding us out, I often think, I see a point, you've got a point. And I think, though, that the total picture is a more nuanced one. I think they can play a useful role, as I just said. And I always wonder which part of global South civil society are we hearing? As is normal in activism, we hear the most loud voices, the ones and the people with the strongest opinions.
Hmm.
Sometimes I wonder what is I don't know how to say this, but what is am I hearing across the spectrum the voices of global South civil society? I'm not always clear on that. Maybe there is a part of civil society in the South that actually thinks they really like to have global North INGOs with them in various capacities, and they don't want um, these roles to all be taken away. I'm not clear on whose voices we are hearing, and are we hearing the whole range? Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I think, as is always the case in any kind of market, right? There's going to be a diversity of opinions, and
Yeah,
it probably depends on geography as well. Maybe in West Africa, it's a slightly different situation from the Philippines, right? In fact, it's definitely going to be a different case.
yeah,
But I think
yeah.
you're right. There is something to that. How much of a problem is it? We will see, I guess. But that does raise an interesting question for me, and this isn't something we plan to talk about, but I want to just throw it out there and see how you think about
Mhm.
it. We mentioned the idea of competition between NGOs, competition between local CSOs and international NGOs. But one thing I struggle to see in this sector is what is the source of creative destruction? Like, like what are
Tell
they?
me
And what I mean by that is in the private sector, if nobody wants your product, if no one buys your product, you will
right.
you will be destroyed. You go out, and the
You
market
disappear,
has this
market.
process of creative destruction. In the
Yeah.
NGO sector, you know, how do you go out of business? How do you stop being? So what are you competing for? I guess is the question.
Mm. Okay. Yes, good question. Interesting one. So I will say, though it doesn't work exactly in the same as in the private sector, and it doesn't
Sure.
work with the same crispness and
Right.
clarity, I
Right.
think,
Okay.
at the same pace. But it does happen. I mean, I'm not an. There are researchers, including a former colleague of mine, who do research on the whole ecosystem for nonprofits, say in the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I recall from their research is that there is a constant churn of new nonprofits and NGOs that are set up.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the reasons for that. That's another interesting.
Right.
I could go on a rant about that, but there is a constant coming into the ecosystem of new actors,
Mm-hmm.
small ones, actually, right, and many stay small. But there's a fair amount of organizational death in the early stages,
Yep. Sure.
right? If an NGO is able to sustain itself for a while, for whatever reasons, then I think the dying off process is less crisp than the creative destruction that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't that doesn't happen, but I think, and this is what is a term I can't reproduce exactly, but in our book that I loved, and it's not ours, but it's there's a lot of organizations that continue to sustain themselves at fairly low levels of efficacy, but they are but they because of the charity model, and we don't have time in this discussion to go into what in the book we made. That is part of our central argument, is that the
Mm-hmm.
charity legal structure in many countries gives these kind of low outcome but institutionally self-sustaining organizations that persist, partially because, of course, um, if you look at the funding side, small donors can easily still, till today, despite all the transparency about greater transparency about outcomes, despite the fact that we have these intermediary platforms like here in the US, Charity Navigator, Giving Well, and many, many others that can help small donors to distill what is a quality nonprofit and what is not. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of small donors still give primarily what I call from the belly, right? They give because it feels good. They
Right.
love this cause. They imagine it will do good work. Their family says that they're giving to them. Their friends, right? Thinking about the peer networks, all of
Sure.
that. I think that's how creative destruction gets at least slowed down a
Right.
lot, and that worries me as well. So yeah.
And the other challenge with that, which you rightly pointed to at the beginning of that statement, is that the creative destruction is being decided not by the beneficiaries, but by the funders.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so that again
Less.
is skews the system and skews the sector.
It does skew, with the one exception, maybe that's scandals. So again, as we said before, local constituents now have most people in this world have access. I mean, there's a gender difference, but to
Mm-hmm.
some form, not necessarily of a smartphone, but a cell phone, they can put in a complaint or criticism. They can put out what used to be called a tweet, etc., and say this organization is corrupt. This organization engages in financial abuse. This organization engages in sex abuse of local women, etc. Right, and that can quickly reverberate. That takes
Yeah.
about half an hour, and it's out in the world. Right.
Yeah.
So in that sense, scandal can sometimes bring it to a abrupt close, but yeah, that's not the majority of cases.
No, it's not, and then it's not an ideal system to
No.
that is being uh,
No.
being monitored by that kind of creative destruction.
Yeah.
But so look, it's not all doom and gloom, is it? And so I want to sort of shift the conversation a little bit to the role of the INGO looking forward, how things are changing. But I wanted to lead into that by just giving an example of an organization that I spoke with the CEO, Fred Nelson of Maliasili. And the reason
Okay.
why I wanted to lead into that is because for me, Maliasili is a fantastic example of
Mm.
this network idea at play, and they've taken this, if we call it a network approach, a network first approach from the very beginning. It was
Okay.
what they were. Um, it's how they were going to deliver their value. It wasn't by building a big, huge organization. It was by concentrating on enabling the NGOs on the ground. And so he now is in, and I forget the numbers, but he's grown very significantly. He was funded 10 years ago by the Malago Foundation. So
Mhm.
that is straight away unrestricted funding for multi year unrestricted funding, as well as
Important to say that. Yes.
absolutely changes the game because that allowed Fred to focus on the problem he was really trying to solve and not have to worry about chasing his tail, raising money. He then built his organization to with local people across sub-Saharan Africa, and to train and enable different to identify, train, and enable leaders across a variety of countries in a variety of different themes. I think they now have 90 NGOs that are part of their network. And
Okay.
the number of employees that they have in their actual structure that are not based in Africa, you can count on one hand, right?
Mm.
And
Mhm.
they're growing very quickly. And he's created this system in which he can take funding and he can distribute it and enable these NGOs at a really meaningfully significant pace. And they're doing great work. And so that, I get excited when I see that kind of thing, because to me that's it's a really appropriate um, implementation of some of these ideas of decentralization and that kind of thing.
I
So
see.
I'm looking forward. I'm still very hopeful. I'm hopeful for change. I'm hopeful for innovation. Having said that, when I look back at the traditional INGO sector, I do, and then I look at this new version. I struggle to see how they're going to get there, or if they're going to get there. And I wonder if you had some thoughts about, what does the future look like for INGOs? How are they responding to this? And is, where are we going with this?
Okay, that's a huge question.
It
Yeah.
is, yeah. Sorry,
Going back to the NGO that you were the
Malia
case
silly, yeah,
Maliasili, right?
yeah.
So I don't know them. Um, I would want to one comment and one question. The question is, what is their governance structure and who makes decisions on all important things? And so that's my question to you. And the comment is just that you said he is funded. So I'm thinking that sounds still like very much founder directed um initially model, right? So tell me a little bit more before I can comment on the salience of that case for what I want to say anyway.
Sure, and that's probably more my language, coming from the private sector and how I think about it. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think Fred would word it that way, and also I can't answer all of those questions because I don't know the details. I only had a hour and a half discussion with Fred, but what I can
Understood.
say is he spends a lot of time thinking about this organization needs to be without me. Like I need to be, he needs to be able to just step away, and then the organization, he needs to be able to get hit by a bus tomorrow, and the
That's great.
organization can well, it's not so great. We
No,
love
no,
Fred.
no, I mean that he thinks a lot of time about that, of course.
Yeah, and that's like and that was his aim from the beginning, and that's
Mm,
the difference, because he wasn't in this to grow an organization. He was in this to solve a problem. Another example of that, I did a call discussion with Simon Berry of Cola Life, and he, after 10 years, is shutting down his NGO this year. I think it was last
yeah.
week he shut it down because he solved the problem. And from
Right.
the people's perspective, his problem was diarrhea medicine in Zambia,
Yeah.
sorry. And from the people's perspective in Zambia, the solution is there. They have no idea that there's this NGO, Cola Life, that helped put it there.
Doesn't
It's
matter.
their, as far as they're concerned, it's their native product, and
And solution.
their solution. And he's out now,
Yeah.
and that, taking that approach means that from the very beginning, you're building the structures and the
I love it.
infrastructure so that when you step out, it's working by itself.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that makes
I,
sense to me, as an entrepreneur, because I'm thinking, okay, these guys are solving a problem, and that, I can understand that thinking, I can understand that approach, I can understand the decisions they've made because they've had that objective from the very beginning. And that's
got it.
where I get confused with something like decolonization, because there seems to be a lot of politics and ideology and things like that. I can't see the direct line to how the benefit uh,
Yeah.
is being delivered better.
And by the way, it's one of the things I'm critical of in our sector. I don't think we're very honest. We're very candid about what are the real interests that are at play. We don't disclose our interests as individual staff,
Hmm.
our leaders, what is our interest in terms of maintaining our jobs, first of all,
Hmm.
maintaining our budget, our team, our power, our status, our identity as a person who can feel good, the do-gooder element, etc.
Right.
Um, so it's generally a problem, and the politicking, it's something that I'm particularly allergic to, is when I see an organization using a lot of value based language, but actually behind the scenes, there is an enormous amount of mainly self interested politicking going on, right?
Right.
I really don't have time for that.
Right.
Um, so having said that, look, Anton, I do think once any type of institution has been in place, and I would argue, by the way, that yes, in the private sector there is greater boundaries put to that, but still, once an organization, any institution has been in place for a while, it will do its mightiest best to keep existing.
Oh,
That's
100%.
just
Agreed.
right
Yeah, sure.
across sectors, and we definitely have seen that in the NGO sector. And as we've already said, the kind of forced exit,
Hmm.
it happens, but it happens not nearly as enough as probably the ecosystem of the sector would do well. In fact, somebody once said to me, our sector is, and they came also from a private sector perspective, they said, our sector is over fragmented and
Hmm.
underscaled. And I think that's true. And that's still the case. So when people, coming back to our topic on passion, I hope you can still follow me where I'm going. Hopefully there's not a tangent. But when people say, oh, I want to set up a new nonprofit, they're thinking about the entry into the ecosystem of new organizations. Whether you're Kenyan or American or Dutch or Uruguayan, I want to set up a new organization. My first impetus is thinking not to hold it up as a hero, but to say, really, do we really need more organizations, or do we need you to put your best minds to existing organizations and make their programming model better or their organization better, blah blah blah. So I think that is a problem. And I loved your example of the time bound organization. In a past life, I once wrote an article with my colleague, when this was in academia, about a case study of one time-bound organization that was set up explicitly to expire after 8 years, for instance.
Hmm.
And we asked the question, why do we not have more of this? Yes, we have programs that are set up that are time bound, but not organizations. And what are the benefits, besides of course some drawbacks, to setting yourself up as a time bound organization from the beginning? I think it's a healthy question to ask, why we don't have more of that.
No, I
So
agree.
um, I do agree with you. But I think I would love for us to finish our conversation a little bit about roles. Like what are, talking your question about the future.
Hmm.
Um, I think there's a lot of change in our sector, as you said.
Yeah.
It's again another big wave, but I'm not sure that in this current wave that we are thinking hard enough about what are still the remaining legitimate roles for which there is a real need. What role change do we need to go through? And can we go there for the last bit of our conversation? Is that of
Yeah,
interest to
no,
you?
absolutely. That I think, and that's I think the big question, really, to be honest.
Yeah.
If the NGOs are going to decentralize, as I would call it, or decolonize, generally that means moving resources, moving decision making more locally. That means, well, what does that mean for the NGO and the people that were occupying those management positions? Uh,
Yeah. Or staff positions.
right. And so then that naturally leads to your question. Well, they should occupy what roles there are that need to be offered. So,
That needs where they still have a complementary role, right? A
right.
function, a value add, right? So I'll mention two. One source that I think is really helpful for anybody who's interested in the future of the sector. So, Peace Direct, a UK-based NGO, has had a small piece out, a small 10-pager out last year,
Hmm.
that my colleague Barney and I also we wrote something that I'll mention in a moment. But so basically, they said in the future, and not too far from now,
Hmm.
not too long from now, the following, I'll just list them here, functions they think are still legitimate. And I think they have a point. So one is to be an interpreter. I'll
Hmm.
just rattle off the roles, and I don't. This is Peace Direct's thought leadership, not mine. So you'll have to ask them. I have Dylan Matthews, their CEO, on the podcast next month.
Okay.
But so there's a role of interpreter, of knowledge broker. You hear that more often.
Hmm.
A trainer coach to some extent. A convener. You hear that. So convener in multi-stakeholder models, particularly a connector and an ecosystem builder to
Hmm.
get to collective impact, an advocate and an amplifier of global civil society, southern civil society,
Hmm.
right? Particularly a watchdog, particularly vis-a-vis in the global north,
Sure.
entities that are in power, a critical friend, and or a sidekick role. I think that those are really interesting and relevant roles that will continue to have legitimacy, right? Barney Talek and Barney is a longtime collaborator. He also contributed to several chapters in our book. He and I wrote a piece for International Civil Society Center about a year before that, where we basically say additional roles would be being campaigning, ally, and presence in one's home countries, right? If you're talking about global North founded civil
Hmm.
society. Obviously related to that, public education and mobilization, again, to connect missions in other countries to social justice issues at home. So if you look at the US, there's a tremendous amount of inequality, injustice, discrimination, etc. in American society. Let's work on that. So let's do more domestic programming work and advocacy work, not just fundraising work, but then connect that to what's happening globally from an education, public education perspective. A third role that we came up with is that upon request, and only upon request, to offer focused consulting services as a global North NGO to global South NGOs, but consulting services of a highly specialized kind of thematic and technical niche.
Mm-hmm.
We could offer policy research services that are targeting primarily government and institutions, private sector included, in the global north. And we said perhaps upon request, again, play a backbone role in networks of global south actors to support collective impact. So those were a couple of additional rules. My point now being saying is I would like us as a sector to focus yet more on that role. Are we rigorous enough in asking ourselves and pinning down what is still a role that is appropriate and what is
Mm-hmm.
no longer, and then really exit those?
Yeah, no, I think that's really intriguing. I would also put out there, it would be interesting to understand what the local communities and the CSOs think of that list, and what they
Good
would,
point.
which roles they believe
Yeah,
NGOs should play. I could actually even, I reckon that if you were to ask most of them, probably the number one thing is going to be funding.
they would still say that. Yes, you're right. And in effect, yeah. Anyway, that gets it to another. But I think that is true. Um, I will say that first of all, I think that Peace Direct, I don't can't claim I know them in great detail, but my sense is that their role definition, those 9 or so roles, were amongst those based on consultation with their partners
Mm-hmm.
and some community consultation. I would imagine, um, and secondly. No, I've lost my train of thought. But yes, I think that funding part is still going to be to some extent important, and that gets us to that kind of my question about, is there a silent majority here that we don't hear as much from? I don't know. I just don't know, Anton.
You know, the other thing that jumps out to me is when you said the consulting services. One
Mm,
thing that you know, the one thing that I immediately think about that, which I believe is interesting and worth talking about, is the idea of the NGOs offering consulting services to the CSOs and the local communities means that it's the CSOs and the local communities who are pulling in
yes,
the service. So they're
yes,
choosing the
they're
service as opposed to
choosing.
it being pushed to them. They're choosing it,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
just that subtle difference could actually make a really significant change, because
Absolutely.
all of these roles and could be delivered, but by letting and the resources that go along with those things, but by letting the CSOs and the local communities pull in the consulting, the pull in the work,
From a
it
market.
it
Yeah,
creates a healthier market dynamic,
yeah,
and so
more power.
and more power to them, right? And so and reestablishes creative destruction in the way that that's healthy. In that, you know, well, if we offer these 50 services to this community, and they only choose 3 of them,
Yeah,
then that tells us that they don't want the other services. So that's information, that's creative destruction at the service level, and it's that's a healthier way to go about things. So if
I, I agree. I will say,
yeah.
and we also need to be real before we finish up here about if many in the sectors are interested to move to become more rigorous about what are their remaining roles. Any of the roles that we sketched between Peace Directs and Barney and mine, and other roles that other people, brilliant people, can think of,
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that it will mean that many less people will have jobs in the sector who currently work there. I think these organizations will be much smaller in size, and they will require different competencies to some extent than what is represented now. So it's a very painful future if you look it in the eye. And sometimes when I say that, uh, I get a kind of a blank stare, and I don't know what that means. And people move on right? But we're talking about very specific niche roles that are much more about connecting than about doing, right?
Right.
And then the interesting kind of meta question I ask myself is, there are, on the one hand, you still see the big philanthropic, especially the private philanthropy that you see, loves to work with very big NGOs
Hmm.
that do soup to nuts still, even if they do it differently, right? So
Right.
the Save the Children's and others of this world. So will we continue to see an ecosystem that has an increasing monopolization and concentration in a couple of big global north founded INGOs that still continue to persist because certain donors want to work with partners of choice
Hmm.
because it's easier for them?
Right.
And then a middle field that is almost completely hollowed out. And then still, there will be citizens all over the world who will insist they want to set up their own shop because they think they have a unique idea, even if that may well be a fantasy, meaning it's a fallacy to think that it's a unique idea that nobody else is already doing. But you will always see that both here, you will always see people of good intent who think they need to set up their own organization. I
Yep.
wish there was less of that, but I don't. I mean, we can't stop citizens to do what they want in free nations, at least, right? So
No,
that's what
exactly.
I. Those are some ruminations towards the future.
No, it's definitely an interesting time
Mm,
outside of this sector, but also in within this sector. Um, you know, I can see there's a lot of change on the horizon, and that's part of why I've wanted to have this conversation as well as launch this podcast to have these kind of conversations, because I really think that there's exciting things on the horizon. Whenever there is change, there's always exciting things as well as a lot of painful things. And the more kind of
yeah.
conversations we can have about those, the the change that's coming, I think the less painful it will be. I'm very
Mm,
conscious of time, Tosca.
yeah.
Just before we wrap up, could you tell us just a little bit about your book and your podcast, as well as perhaps other work that you're doing with Five Oaks, or
Yeah.
if people want to get in contact with you or anything like that, could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes, so I have an active presence on LinkedIn, so that's where people might want to go first.
Yep.
Um, my website is five, as in the number five, Oaks, with a plural, so oak trees, as in plural,
I'll
consulting.
put this a link in the comments as well.
Yeah, I was hoping you would.
Yeah.
And the book that I'm only a co-author of, together
Yes.
with George Mitchell and Hans-Peter Schmitz, and with contributions by Barney Telek, who I mentioned, is called Between Power and Irrelevance: The Future of Transnational NGOs. You can find a link to the book and you can buy it at lots of online seller places. You can find a link on the site. It's a 2020 book, and I'm excited to say, also daunted, that we have just been asked by Oxford University Press, our publisher, to produce an update to the book, which
Fantastic.
rough estimate will come out in 2026. My podcast is called NGO Soul and Strategy, and that soul has nothing to do with spirituality, but it has to do with the identity, the mindset, the DNA of the sector, the culture that you always hear me go on and on about. So NGO Soul and Strategy, you can find that on my website as well. And so I think those are the best way. I also, together with a colleague, Ahmed, um, he and I offer a course on virtual team leadership skills in our sector. So I'll make sure to get you the link to that as well, so that people can check that out. Those are the best ways, I think.
Okay. Fantastic. Tosca, I very much enjoyed this broad conversation. It's
It was.
and I really thank you for coming along and being game to join me in this conversation. And I hope we can do it again one day. Thank you.
I will look forward to that. Thank you.
All right. Bye bye.